for joining us today. I'd like to welcome everybody to the fourth webinar in the annual Cronin Finalist Webinar Series. Each year, NASPO hosts the Cronin Awards for Procurement Excellence, honoring innovation and excellence in state procurement. The awards program seeks to recognize outstanding procurement initiatives and serves as a means to disseminate and to encourage adoption of breakthrough initiatives by other states. Submissions for the awards are scored based on 4 important criteria: innovation, transferability, service improvement, and cost reduction. By excelling in these key areas, Cronin awardees and finalists help create opportunities for improving the procurement function nationwide. This webinar series is an important part of sharing information and ideas for professionals across the country. And like I said, I thank you all for joining us today. There's just a couple of reminders that I have before we get things started. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on NASPO's website and the YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Because we are recording, I have muted everyone's phone lines. We will have a question and answer time at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions that you would like to ask at this time, please unmute your phone by dialing *6, or you can type your questions into the chat box on the right part of your screen, and I will be happy to ask them for you. For those of you that would like to receive UPPCC certification credit for attending this webinar, please email me, Kevin Miner, at the conclusion, and I will be happy to send you a certificate. My email is on the screen, but again, it is kminer@naspo.org. Now I would like to introduce our speaker for today. It's Christopher Hughes, who is the Director for the Division of Purchasing in the state of Utah. He will be presenting on their Gold Award submission, ValuePoint Cloud Solutions Procurement. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for everyone that's taking the time out of their busy lives to listen in today to learn more about this procurement and the process that the state of Utah went through to get this procurement. Again, our submission was entitled Utah's ValuePoint Cloud Solution Procurement, and my name's Christopher Hughes, the Director for Purchasing for the state of Utah. As we begin, I'd like to first start off, because as I was the one asked to present on this, it really was a team effort that went through this whole process. And I would be failing all of those people, and there's many more than just what I'm going to mention. But I would like to thank Dugan Petty at the beginning, Richard Pennington, Jeff Modishaw, Jennifer Saltz, Kent Beers, and Doug Richens for all the help that they provided as the state of Utah went through this procurement for cloud services. As we started this cloud solutions procurement with the help of NASPO ValuePoint, it was a big crossroads for many of us, because as the quote says that is on display now, is new technology emerges, so do the way that we have to go out and procure that technology. Sometimes our old rules, our old processes don't work with the new types of goods and services that are becoming readily available to our customers, to the public entities that we represent. So I don't know where this quote came from, but it's something that Dugan Petty and I have used quite frequently as we've gone around to present on the cloud solutions procurement. And it's a simple quote that all old rules clash with the new way of doing business, making it difficult or even impossible for cloud vendors to submit a bid. And this is absolutely true. This cloud solutions procurement with NASPO ValuePoint did not just start 3 or 4 years ago, but started years ago when it was still NASPO. And it was the state of Utah that led the first cloud solicitation for WSCA. And in that, we tried to use the old rules that dealt with general procurement. We tried to use the same methods and processes that we had done with buying other goods and services. And at the end of that contract, there were 4 vendors on contract, and it wasn't used that often because the vendors could not provide adequate services based off of how it was procured. And by the time that the state of Utah signed contracts with some of those vendors on the first go-around, the services had already been modified enough where they weren't falling within the scope of work that had been solicited. And it caused problems throughout for many of the states that tried to use that old cloud services contract. In fact, it caused so many problems for one of the vendors that they weren't able to provide services under it because of how inflexible it was. It did not allow for them to really get a good grasp of the terms and conditions and how those terms and conditions related to cloud services, nor did it allow them to become fluid in their product offerings, their service offerings. As I think we've all seen, technology, and especially cloud, has gone up in has advanced throughout the years. And so we were in that contract and realized we needed to change. We needed to bring about a new way of contracting for the types of cloud services to be able to procure what was needed by the CIOs and the other public entities that we represent. And about that time that we started to think about how do we go about a new solicitation, we found a survey that probably said what we all thought. And it's a survey from 2015 that stated, that was from NASPO, that 40% of state CIOs said that they were dissatisfied with the current system of IT procurement. And it was something that Dugan, Jeff, and Jennifer and Kent really thought about, of how do we get a better cloud services contract? How do we put something in place that can grow with technology, that is flexible enough for vendors, that it allows them to provide the quality services in the cloud that they're capable of providing and not having to worry about how rigid an old process was. So the first thing that we did is that we decided that we needed to become more collaborative. We needed to bring CIOs and other IT procurement professionals from around the nation together to be able to hash out the problems of the old cloud contract and figure out what we needed to do in a new cloud contract that could help states procure cloud services. So we along with NASPO ValuePoint, the state of Utah with NASPO ValuePoint brought in a lot of CIOs and a lot of IT procurement professionals and brought them to Salt Lake City for a day session of determining how to go out and procure cloud and how to make it work this time. And it was in that session that a lot of different ideas were thrown about, ideas of what states were looking for, and not only what the state's current needs were, but where the contracts needed to go. And it was through this collaborative effort that we were able to get insight from not only CIOs, but state CPOs as well about what would work and what would not, and ultimately what would a good contract look like. And it was one of the first procurements to provide an integration of a ValuePoint sourcing team and an advisory council consisting of representatives of 10 state information technology offices and the National Association of State Chief Information Officers. So following that one-day meeting, we had a lot of information that we could use to be able to determine how to go about procuring cloud. And it was after that meeting that we did develop that advisory council to help out the state of Utah as we moved forward with that cloud solicitation. As part of that collaborative effort, we started to reach out to our other counterparts throughout the nation to see what they had done, to see how they were successful in procuring cloud services, to see what had worked for them and what had not worked. We probably in the state of Utah spent a lot of hours finding as many solicitations throughout the nation on cloud services and contacting those procurement professionals that had issued those solicitations and gathering a lot of feedback from them of how they were viewing the cloud industry at that point. It became such a collaborative effort that we started to receive feedback from states that had not even attended the initial conference here in Utah to discuss the new cloud solicitation. As we opened up our phone lines and emails to these other states, countless people started to email us suggestions. Countless people wanted to start participating in on this cooperative contract to be able to give their input into what they were looking for. And I've put on this map some of the states that were the most vocal. I would probably state that I received contact from a vast majority of states throughout the nation. However, as I went through my emails, these were the emails that were easy for me to find and locate and identify who from what states were working with me to help develop the solicitation. Now, in the solicitation, we had a lot of turnover in the state of Utah. Jeff Modishaw started on this solicitation as the lead, with Jennifer Saltz acting as the backup. Jeff ultimately left the state of Utah Division of Purchasing to go work in another division, and Jennifer Saltz took over for a little bit until she was named as the Assistant Director for the Division of Purchasing. And then when she left, when she took that position, I took over as the lead for the state of Utah for this solicitation. But it was already through that collaborative effort that we were able to keep the momentum going and that we were able to continue moving forward and not having a break in moving forward. It was through Dugan and all of NASPO ValuePoint that we were able to continue on this collaborative effort, to continue to bring a lot of information together to see what was working in each state. Now, as many of you know, as you start to reach out to all 50 states, all 50 states have different rules, different laws as they deal with privacy, as they deal with internet security. Each one of us has unique ways of looking at it. Some states a little more mature than others, but in the end it was nice to get so much feedback to see what was actually a best practice and what we could improve upon in the solicitation. So we started to reach out more throughout this collaborative process to see what other entities or other companies were out there that could be a resource to the state of Utah and be a resource to all of you in knowing that Utah had done its due diligence. And Dugan and I came across and Dugan was aware of the Center for Digital Government, who had set up a standard set of model terms and conditions for cloud services. And it was really through them that we got a unique approach of not just trying to put out one standard set of terms and conditions, but they took the approach, and what we mirrored was a standard set of terms and conditions for each of the three common services offered in cloud for platform, infrastructure, and software. It was by using and leveraging what they had already done in establishing those model cloud terms and conditions that we were able to come into some sort of moment of understanding of how we could move forward in the cloud in probably one of the trickiest parts of it, in those terms and conditions. And what was nice about the Center for Digital Government is that they did not create these model terms and conditions on their own. They had brought in vendors that were already in the cloud that wanted to participate to help them draft these model terms and conditions. So it was a collaborative effort on their part to be able to hear the vendors out and know what was a standard practice and what was not in establishing the terms and conditions. So as the state of Utah moved forward, it was able to overcome the terms and conditions issue by relying on what had already taken place by the Center for Digital Government, and that saved the state and NASPO ValuePoint an enormous time and resources in trying to establish our own set of terms and conditions for this procurement. With that going on, the state of Utah was able to, with Dugan Petty, was able to leverage our expertise and connect with the provincial government of British Columbia as they were working on their own cloud solicitation for Canada. As word was spreading and the collaborative effort was moving forward, we worked with Cloud BC, as they call themselves, to be able to find out what was an industry standard for public procurement of cloud services. In fact, when we first connected with Cloud BC, they were ahead of us in terms of where they were in their solicitation, that they had received guidance from others and that they were moving forward with wanting to issue their solicitation. And we set up a regular phone call with them probably every other week to discuss what new news they had and what new news we had. Is we wanted to be in this together to make sure that it worked for all of us. Ultimately, they are not a part of the NASPO ValuePoint solicitation, but we were able to work with them in a manner that showed that we were experiencing the same difficulties in procuring cloud and that we were trying to resolve them in the same manner. Because in reality, a lot of it is we are working with the same vendors in terms of who was going to respond and the capabilities of what needed to be met with all of the uniqueness of cloud and dealing with public entities. It was through our discussions with Cloud BC and some other collaborative efforts that we were able to come across the Cloud Security Alliance, CSA, and they are a tool for helping to identify security capabilities. In that initial meeting in Salt Lake, the number one issue that we came across was how do we make sure we are getting secure capabilities? With all of the different requirements that each state has, how do we create a model framework that will help us to identify the capabilities of the cloud providers, and how do we make a crosswalk with those capabilities to ensure they meet state, local, and federal requirements? And this was a huge burden that we were looking at and really stressing over some time, because as I said, as we talked with other states, they all had each of their unique approaches of how they needed to deal with cloud and whether or not that they could even use cloud, because it's completely turning the IT industry on its head, and especially in the public sector, as we've gone from the traditional method of acquisition to a method of procuring the services of the cloud providers. In addition, it takes away some of the ownership that the states have been used to, and it affects the hosting of the data as it moves from on-prem to in the cloud. And so in our first meeting, that was the number one priority, is how do we develop the right specifications to be able to go out there and know that the vendors on contract are able to meet the requirements of the public entities that will use the master agreements. And it was ultimately through CSA that they had already developed a crosswalk. They had already developed an Excel spreadsheet that had all of the major requirements already outlined, and all of the cloud vendors, or the majority of them, had already participated in CSA in some capacity, had already filled out their questionnaire and had become certified. And it's through that questionnaire that CIOs could use that information to be able to determine whether a provider meets their requirements, whatever they may be, and the capabilities of those cloud providers. So it was through these three collaborative efforts, four, as we go back to all of the states, that we were able to help create that solicitation. and not make it so burdensome and so rigid that no vendor could respond, or so rigid that we wouldn't be able to have flexibility as cloud continued to evolve. Going back to the CSA, is that they had different levels of security and data control framework, whether it was the CCM, the CAI, or the CSA STAR registry. All of these documents were already usually filled, or they usually were already filled out by the vendors that were going to be submitting. And it provided a nice little crosswalk that public entities are able to use in making a determination of which master agreement they want to use, because they can see the capabilities and the data control framework that these vendors have in place. The other nice thing about what we've done here, and it was unique for Utah, is that we developed an RFP that allows for a 2-year competitive technology refresh to be able to allow for evolving technologies and allow for new vendors to hop onto these master agreements at a minimum every 2 years, or not at a minimum, but it allows us to open up the RFP every 2 years if we choose, if we've made a determination that technology has advanced and that we want to be able to view new vendors and get new cloud solutions on contract. Now, this is not just to allow new vendors to get on, but the requirement in a refresh is to say that any vendor that has a current contract, a current master agreement, they must recertify that they meet all of the specifications that were in that solicitation. They don't have to resubmit a 100-page response, but they have to recertify to the state of Utah that they still meet those minimum qualifications and that they can still provide the solutions that are needed under the cloud contracts. This is interesting because, as we found out, many IT companies may have a very good initial start, and maybe we've had experiences in states where an IT contractor gets a contract, and then in a year or two they go under because they're not able to continue on in their business. And we wanted to make sure that all the vendors on the cloud contracts were having to recertify and demonstrate that they were still able to meet the minimum requirements. So the refresh serves 2 purposes. First, to be able to allow new technology to be added. As we know, cloud continues to evolve, and the uses of cloud continue to evolve. And second, it allows us to be able to really recertify those vendors that are on contract so that they can continue to demonstrate that they have a high quality of, that they can provide a high quality service. And if a requirement comes out from the federal government regarding cloud, we can make them demonstrate that they can meet that requirement, whatever it may be. And if they cannot, then they may lose their contract. But the refresh allows for both of those things to occur in order to ensure that we are providing adequate adequate controls over the vendors. So kind of, again, as we talked about it, is by being able to break apart and use the model cloud terms and conditions that were established by the Center of Digital Government, we were able to allow more flexibility on how vendors could respond. It's not all the vendors provide all 3 levels of, or all 3 services or solutions that are generally associated with the cloud. Some provide only SaaS solutions, some only provide infrastructure, some provide just platform, and some provide all 3. But we did not want to say that they needed to provide all 3 in order to respond. So what was nice about the model, the Center for Digital Government's terms and conditions, what we really appreciated and what we were able to take advantage of, is that we could match the terms and conditions to the service and solutions model that the vendors were responding. This allowed for more flexibility. in these vendors to be able to respond to only the service models that they provided. And this is unique because traditionally in what we had done before with the cloud contract, in the first one that did not work, is we said everybody has to be able to provide certain types of services and meet certain models. And it did not work because it did not allow for flexibility of vendors that did not provide everything in the solicitation, even though there were high quality vendors that just missed out. So by having a set of 3 terms and conditions, it allows for the flexibility for vendors to be able to adequately describe what they're providing and match those terms and conditions up to it. Now in the refresh, it's not just about allowing for new technology to evolve. As we know, a lot of these companies acquire one another, they develop new technologies, and a vendor that did not provide, let's say, platform as a service the first go around, they would be able to qualify for other services in the refresh in the next go around, and they would be able to provide those terms and conditions and match their service models to what's in their contract without any confusion. So the approach that we took was one that brought everybody together. It was a collaborative effort. We had to use many entities, many states provided countless hours to come in and help us to understand cloud. We were able to utilize experts in New Jersey, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, just to name a few, where they were able to step up and provide and dedicate time and resources to us. It was a unique approach because it wasn't one where it was just the state of Utah was handling it and being isolated from everybody. This approach was one that really brought the states together over a common concern and a common issue in terms of public procurement. And so it was through all of this that we were able to create the solicitation we had. Now, as we met, and I'm going to go back to that first meeting, one of the issues that was brought up is that the CIOs wanted a dynamic marketplace for them to be able to go and know that the vendors on contract were qualified, but give the CIOs the ability to be able to select the vendors that they felt more comfortable with, rather than just limiting the contracts to 1 or 2 vendors. And it was that dynamic solution that allowed the state, or question that allowed the state of Utah to be able to open this up to all vendors that met the minimum specifications and met the minimum score thresholds. And as many of you know, there's probably over 38 vendors on contract currently in the NASPO ValuePoint, on NASPO ValuePoint. And that may seem like a lot to some of you of saying, well, why are there 38 vendors on contract? But that is because all 38 of those vendors are qualified. All 38 of those vendors are able to meet the requirements, to meet the technical criteria to allow for that dynamic marketplace. Now, that doesn't mean that you just have to go select one and be done with it. You can compare master agreement vendors to one another to be able to continue to make a best value determination based off of those vendors. And a lot of those vendors are resellers of the major companies that maybe you noticed aren't on there, like Amazon or Microsoft. But they provide the same level of service and provide the same cloud service as Amazon and Microsoft. And it was through an understanding that we could actually understand, how does this have to work in a marketplace? How do we establish this in a way that allows for enough flexibility to get vendors on that states will use and feel comfortable with? And it was through that by creating this marketplace of qualified vendors that we'll be able to find vendors that can meet each state's needs and provide the services to them in a high quality. And as more states move forward into cloud, it allows for the flexibility of these contracts to continue to grow and meet all of the needs. And so this was a very innovative process because, like I mentioned, it was working with teams and not just working as procurement professionals, but opening the door for CIOs and other IT professionals to be able to provide their input. This wasn't just a state-level approach, as we had participation from cities and counties throughout the nation as well, not just within Utah's walls. It was innovative because, again, by being able to leverage so many others, we were able to demonstrate that it's all right to reach across the aisle at times to be able to come together and come up with the solution that's necessary and that can be used throughout. And it was innovative for many reasons, but one is that we were able to reach across the border and talk to our Canadian counterparts and at times our counterparts in the UK that were going through the same issues, and talk to them and figure out what's worked in the past and what were they looking for. And it was through this framework that we were able to get out of those old ways of doing procurement and move into a new area of being able to be more collaborative in how we approach solicitations and open up more discussions with other entities that purchase from our contracts or know of the contracts. And ultimately, it was through this process that we were able to be very transparent, as we opened up discussions with many, many entities to be able to understand what was going on and how we could approach it. And so that's really my presentation to this point, is that it was great and it was very nice to be able to work with so many smart people throughout this process, to be able to collaborate with them and to have ideas bounced off of our head. A lot of the CIOs would come in and ask, well, why is that the process? What can we do to modify the old procurement process to be able to buy what we need to buy? And so the purpose of this solicitation, like I said, was to establish multiple master agreements with the qualified vendors so that each state could enter into the contracts that they needed to and provide the flexibility that they needed to when selecting from those vendors. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
And I'll just interject, and at this time, if anybody has any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat box, and I can relay them to Chris, or he can answer them himself. Or you can press *6, unmute your line, and you can ask your question verbally. And while we're waiting for some more questions, Chris, I have one for you. Is there anything that you would have done differently throughout the process, from developing through the implementation?
So what was so nice about this is that we never stuck to a rigid plan as we approached how to go apart from this solicitation, is that we were given enough latitude. We were given enough latitude in the state of Utah to abound by our procurement code, but to be able to pivot when needed and not just say, this is how we're going to do it and this is what we're going to do. As we came across different ideas from states, different ideas from entities, different ideas all around, or if we heard of an idea, we were able to pivot. So when I come back and say, is there anything that I would have liked to change in the process? No, is that I felt like we stayed on point of meeting our key objectives, of being able to bring out a contract through this process, or bring out contracts through this process that were able to meet the objectives that that advisory group was looking for. The only thing I kind of wish I would have added, though, was to put a limit on the number of pages that vendors could have used in responding, because if no one's heard, or if you haven't heard, we had about we had 10,000 pages in responses from over 50 vendors that responded. And it was a huge effort to be able to go and review those and have the evaluation team put that effort into understanding each vendor's proposal and score it appropriately. And we did that. I feel as though each vendor was scored appropriately based off of being able to be flexible in how the approach was done.
Wow, that just seems like a very large responsibility. Can you maybe just maybe go into a little bit more detail on like how the communication between the evaluation? You said you had so many different contracts coming in. What did the communication look like for your team?
So the communication was very fluid. It was one of the nicest parts, since I think we had established an openness to be able to communicate from the very beginning. No one was afraid to communicate. There was almost a trust there that no one could offend anybody else in saying what they were saying, and there was a trust there that nobody felt like they were going to be shamed for asking a question. And so as the evaluation team went through some of these proposals, there were questions thrown out because the evaluation team didn't quite understand how a vendor was responding, and we were able to use experts from other states under the Utah Procurement Code that evaluators are able to ask questions to other experts. And so we had a team of 7 evaluators, but in total we probably used over 20 or 30 people to help answer questions for those evaluators. So I think from the very beginning, and I probably should have mentioned this, is that we set a culture in allowing questions to be asked and allowing people to have the freedom to question what was going in the solicitation. We probably went through 4 or 5 dozen drafts of the solicitation as we sent out draft after draft to evaluators, as we sent draft after draft out to experts, as we sent draft after draft to anybody that would want to read it. And they would come back with honest feedback, and no one was afraid to say, well, I don't want to mention this because maybe it only applies to Utah or it only applies to Wisconsin or Illinois. Is that they came back wanting to ask the questions to make this fair and open. And I think that's something that I definitely learned, and what I'm trying to implement in the state of Utah is to always have my procurement professionals be in inquiry, always asking questions of the project managers to make sure that we're meeting the requirements of a solicitation, and make sure that we're always understanding what the need of the procurement item is. Because if we don't understand either of those things, then the procurement's going to fail, and someone's going to have a sour taste in their mouth after. And I probably should have started it this way. If anybody thinks that I was a cloud expert at the beginning of this, then they're wrong. If anybody thinks that I'm a cloud expert at the end of this solicitation, then they're wrong as well. It's because I was able to lean on so many intellectual giants that were a part of this, Dugan Petty being one of them, that I was able to lean on his expertise, that I was able to lean on others to be able to let me know when I was wrong, and to let me know that they thought, okay, we see where you're going, but this is what you really need. And I took no offense to what anybody ever told me, because I almost felt like there was no ownership on my end, because this was being done in such a collaborative effort by bringing so many people together. So I see the question from James Norris. Are there any lessons learned from this massive undertaking that you took away from this experience that could potentially apply to other procurements? Yeah, there's a lot of them. The first one being that communication. Make sure, as I took this on, it was one of my first procurements that I ever ran for the state of Utah. Kind of to say that out loud, I was always kind of the legal person within the division of purchasing, but on this one I was able to lead a procurement. And I looked at myself not as a procurement professional, but as a project manager, of being able to facilitate discussion. And whenever I saw a conflict between two things that were being presented to me, I always brought those parties together to be able to make sure that we were in the same domain, that we were able to meet and discuss and make sure that we were talking about the same topics. Because if we were not talking about the same data protection, then the conversation would never come to a conclusion. But if we were able to meet up and discuss about exactly the topic and both parties were able to understand what they were discussing, we were able to come up with solutions. In a massive undertaking like this, is you would expect protest, you would expect vendors to be a little upset about how things had turned out. I can say I believe that there was one, maybe two protests or vendors contesting what had happened, and when we met with them to discuss or provided a letter back to them to discuss why, they were fine with it. They understood the process because we had been so open and transparent throughout it. So I would say if you take on any big undertaking, if your statutes allow, find a way to have a discussion with vendors. And we did that through what we call as a request for information. Is prior to releasing the final RFP document, we released a draft RFP document and allowed vendors to provide feedback. And the vendors provided feedback. We probably got well over 4,000 pages of feedback from where we were at. And it was me taking that information, compiling it, and sending that out to the right parties to be able to get feedback back on it of whether or not they thought it was an industry standard or whether they thought it was a vendor just trying to get a leg up. But because of that, everybody, my team felt very valued. I believe my team felt very, very valued, that they knew that their responses were a part of the collective and that they were being listened to and actually heard. And I think as a procurement professional, sometimes the people we work with may not think we're hearing them out because we're trying to make sure that they comply with our procurement codes. But a focus of mine was really ensuring that I was hearing everything out. And because the vendors had a say and were able to provide feedback before the final RFP, they were able to know what was going on, and an energy was created from the vendors as well. Now, ultimately, the final RFP wasn't perfect. Vendors submitted over 585 questions within a 60-day period to me. And so that's quite a few questions to get out and get responses back to, and not just say, hey, respond to the RFP and we'll see how it goes for you. But we provided honest feedback to the vendors about their questions so that they could know that they were being heard and that they knew how to respond to the RFP. And in fact, because of all the prior communication that I had with my team and everyone involved, responses to the questions that the vendors submitted came back almost the same day, is that everybody was excited to respond to all the questions that I was sending them. Whether or not they liked it, they all responded, and we built on that collaborative effort throughout, not just the solicitation creation, but throughout the RFP and throughout the evaluation process as well.
Awesome. Yeah, actually, you mentioned how the vendor community responded. Can you elaborate just a little bit more on how they responded to this project?
You know what, and thanks for bringing that up because I had some more points to discuss on that. By bringing that RFI draft to light, I didn't get any calls from vendors wanting to get a leg up on, hey, what's going on, where are you at with this? They were very respectful of the whole process, is that they understood and were provided good insight, and that they felt, I know I got feedback that the vendors really appreciated being able to provide their feedback as well, because they're a part of this. No matter what procurement we put out, whether it's for cloud solicitations or fish finders, the vendor community is a part of what we do, and we have to make sure that they're in alignment of what we're doing, or no party's ever going to be happy. And so as the vendors provided feedback through that RFI response, we could show to them, and they could see that in the final RFP, that we had taken into consideration a lot of what they requested. And I think it went a long way for the vendors to know that we're in this, we're trying to figure this out together. Because I know, as I've spoken with vendors about cloud, is it's difficult to work with a public entity because of that's the way it's always been done mentality before, is that they're trying to get into an industry, they're trying to get into public entities to help improve what we do, and sometimes that can be difficult. But they were grateful that we were willing to listen and understand what they provided. And a shout out goes to just Richard Pennington, because he was great in knowing and kind of providing feedback in everything that we did along the way to ensure that we were in compliance with NASPO ValuePoints processes, to make sure that we weren't doing anything that we weren't supposed to, that we were always staying in alignment. And he was able to bring in a few states as well to be able to communicate with us. So just going back to James's question, is what can you do moving forward on large procurements, is collaborate and listen. If you're not doing any of, what I've learned is if you don't do those things, it's going to be a difficult road on any major procurement. I tell my staff all the time is I didn't hire you to be experts on what you buy. I hired you to be experts on the process and make sure when somebody wants something bought, we keep them in alignment with the state's laws.
Well, and you know what's so interesting to me is you keep going back to this communication and implementing teams both internally and externally, this culture of communication and it being okay to ask questions and no one being afraid to ask questions. Was that difficult? Was that a difficult thing to implement?
Not when we did it right at the offset. I think when we held that meeting here in Salt Lake City, and I thank Kent and Doug for doing that, is that everyone in the room had a voice in that meeting. And I want to say we had between 40 and 50 people in that room, and not everybody had the same viewpoints. Not everybody had the same beliefs on what was needed in cloud. Not everybody believed that it could be done in terms of getting something out that could help all states participate. But at that very beginning, Doug was very influential of allowing people to voice their opinions, to be able to be heard, and to be able to understand the different viewpoints that were coming from that. I mean, if you put all of us in a room, we're not going to agree on how public procurement should be done. But if you put us in a room and we know that we're being listened to and that our thoughts and our beliefs are being valued, then it opens up that communication to allow it to happen more. And when that occurs, then people are fine when you don't do something that they're requesting, because they understand there's different viewpoints and we're trying to do this as a collective.
Excellent. Does anybody else have any more questions for Chris? Chris, do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I just thank everybody again. If anybody has any other questions for me offline, I'm always happy to respond to any question regarding this cloud solicitation or anything in general. I'm always happy to talk.
Absolutely. You can also contact me. My name, again, is Kevin Miner at kminer@naspo.org, and I'm happy to connect you with Chris. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I definitely want to thank Chris. Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. For everyone that attended, remember my email address is kminer@naspo.org. If you want to receive certification credit for attending today's webinar, and I will be posting this recording, this webinar, on NASPO's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and I'm happy to share it with you so that you can share it with your colleagues or anyone that was not able to attend. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly.
Hey, Kevin, before we end, I see that I have some of my evaluators on the phone call, and they were absolutely brilliant. It was amazing how we were able to get so many brilliant people to be evaluators on this team. So I appreciate every state that helped in some capacity, but it wasn't as though you were just sending an evaluator to say you sent someone. It was, I feel like we got the best and the brightest from states, so it was great. If every procurement was this easy, people would be happy with public procurement.
Awesome. I think that is a wonderful note to end on. So thank you again, Chris, very much, and thanks everybody for attending today.
Thank you.